In the smoky underworld of early 20th century New York, one man dared to challenge the old ways, rewrite the rules, and build a criminal empire so powerful that its influence stretched from the streets of Manhattan to the casinos of Havana, and even into the highest reaches of American politics. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and his story is not just about crime, but about transformation. Picture this. New York in the 1920s was a city divided not just by ethnic lines, but by traditions. The old Sicilian bosses, known as the Mustache Petes, demanded loyalty to the past. They clung to rigid rules that limited alliances to Italians, excluded outsiders, and resisted innovation. But America was changing fast. The melting pot of immigrants created new opportunities, and Prohibition had opened a river of cash for those bold enough to seize it. Enter Luciano. Unlike the older dons, he understood something fundamental. Crime in America had to be modernized. It had to look beyond old vendettas and embrace business-like efficiency. And more than that, he saw that power wasn't just about fear, it was about structure. Luciano wasn't the biggest gangster of his time, nor was he the most violent. But he had vision. He looked at the chaos of bootlegging wars, the endless bloodshed between Italian and Jewish gangs, and he saw not disorder, but opportunity. What if the Mafia could function like a corporation? What if rivalries could be settled not with bullets, but with meetings, votes, and agreements? This wasn't just a dream. Luciano made it real. Through calculated alliances, ruthless betrayal, and an unshakable belief that business must come before tradition, he created the framework that would define organized crime for decades: the Commission. But the path to power was anything but smooth. Luciano would betray mentors, outsmart rivals, and barely survive assassination attempts. He would rise from a poor Sicilian immigrant kid hustling on the Lower East Side to the undisputed boss of bosses, the man who made the Mafia a national powerhouse. And in the process, he would leave a legacy that is studied not just by law enforcement, but by anyone who wants to understand how power can be built, consolidated, and ultimately destroyed. The irony? For all his brilliance, Luciano's empire would eventually collapse under the same thing that built it: trust and betrayal. His allies would turn, his power would fade, and his later years would be spent in exile. Yet even then, his influence never truly disappeared. To this day, Lucky Luciano is remembered not just as another gangster, but as the architect of modern organized crime. So, how did a boy from a small village in Sicily become the mastermind who reshaped America's underworld? How did he survive wars, betrayals, and the watchful eyes of the government to rise as the most influential mob boss of his generation? And more importantly, what lessons can we draw from his story about ambition, about power, and about the cost of reaching too high? This is not just the story of a criminal. It is the story of a man who changed the rules of the game forever. And it all begins not in New York's neon-lit streets, but in the humble, sun-baked fields of Sicily, where a boy named Salvatore Lucania first opened his eyes to a world of hardship, opportunity, and danger. The story of Lucky Luciano doesn't begin with the power suits, the Commission, or the casinos of Havana. It begins in a small Sicilian village called Lercara Fridi, a rugged mining town near Palermo. Born as Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, he entered a world defined by poverty and limited opportunity. His father, Antonio, was a sulfur miner, breaking his back daily for meager wages. His mother, Rosalia, worked tirelessly to keep the household together. Life in Sicily was harsh, especially for families like the Lucanias. The land was unforgiving, jobs scarce, and corruption deeply entrenched. For young Salvatore, the future seemed predetermined: either toil endlessly in the mines like his father, or find another way to escape the suffocating grip of poverty. That escape came in 1906, when the Lucania family joined the wave of immigrants leaving Europe for America. The promise of the New World was irresistible. Packed onto a ship with thousands of other hopefuls, the Lucanias made the treacherous journey across the Atlantic, eventually passing through the gates of Ellis Island. The dream was simple: opportunity, prosperity, and a chance at a better life. But the reality of New York was far different. Settling in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the family found themselves in one of the toughest neighborhoods in America. Overcrowded tenements, rampant disease, and gang activity defined the landscape. Poverty didn't vanish. It simply changed its form. For young Salvatore, now called Charles in an attempt to Americanize his name, the Lower East Side became his true school. Formal education was brief. Luciano never finished beyond the 5th grade. Instead, he learned the language of the streets. The lessons weren't in books, but in survival. Who to trust, who to fear, and how to get by when the odds were stacked against you. It didn't take long for Charles to carve out a place for himself. While many immigrant children followed their parents into low-paying factory jobs, Luciano had no patience for grinding poverty. He began running small hustles, carrying groceries, shining shoes, selling papers. But soon, his ambitions grew. By his teens, Luciano discovered that crime, even on a small scale, could pay far better than honest work. He organized neighborhood kids to run errands, extort smaller kids for protection money, and move petty contraband. His charm made him likable, but his fists ensured respect. One of the defining traits of Luciano, even at this young age, was his ability to build bridges across ethnic lines. While the older Sicilian generation insisted on sticking to their own, Luciano befriended Jewish and Irish kids in the neighborhood. This skill forming alliances beyond tradition would later become the foundation of his empire. By age 14, Luciano was fully immersed in street life. He dropped out of school and started hanging around with local gangs, absorbing the codes of honor, loyalty, and violence that governed the underworld. He also began earning a reputation for fearlessness. According to later accounts, he offered neighborhood boys a choice: pay him a nickel each week for protection or get beaten up. It sounds like childish bullying, but it was the early prototype of the rackets he would run as an adult. Even then, Luciano was learning how to systematize crime, how to turn intimidation into steady profit. During this period, he also forged connections that would change his life. He befriended Meyer Lansky, a sharp and ambitious Jewish kid, after a fight that ended in mutual respect. Unlike the old Sicilian bosses, Luciano didn't see Lansky's ethnicity as a barrier. He saw potential. Together, they formed a bond that would last decades and serve as one of the most powerful alliances in organized crime history. By the time he reached his late teens, Charles Lucania was already on the radar of local police. Arrests for petty theft, shoplifting, and drug possession peppered his early record. But his luck seemed uncanny. Time and again, charges were dropped, witnesses vanished, or sentences were light. The nickname Lucky stuck after two critical events. First, he survived a brutal beating and throat slashing in 1929, an attack so severe that it left his face scarred and his voice permanently raspy. Second, his repeated escapes from serious prison time convinced friends and rivals alike that fate seemed to favor him. From then on, Salvatore Lucania was gone. The world would know him as Lucky Luciano, a name destined to echo through Mafia history. Luciano's childhood and early years in New York were not glamorous. They were marked by hunger, violence, and the constant struggle to fit in as an immigrant. But it was in this crucible of hardship that he forged the qualities that defined him: resilience, vision, and a ruthless understanding of power. While other kids from the Lower East Side dreamed of escaping poverty through hard work, Luciano dreamed bigger. He didn't want to survive, he wanted to dominate. And step by step, hustle by hustle, he began laying the foundation for the empire he would one day command. The story was only beginning. The next chapter would see Lucky Luciano climb higher into the criminal underworld, rubbing shoulders with notorious bootleggers, learning from ruthless bosses, and preparing to take the Mafia into a new era. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, America drank its way into opportunity. The Volstead Act outlawed liquor, and with that ban came an enormous black market. For a hustler like Charles Lucky Luciano, Prohibition was not a moral crisis. It was a business plan. By the early 1920s, Luciano was no longer a street kid making nickels from protection schemes. He was a resourceful operator who understood supply chains before the term existed. He could source liquor, move it, sell it, and protect the pipeline. That combination, procurement, logistics, and muscle, would transform small-time thieves into organized enterprises. Luciano's first step was to expand his contacts. In the teeming neighborhoods of Manhattan and Brooklyn, he forged relationships across ethnic lines: Jewish, Irish, and Italian figures who shared access to suppliers, trucks, harbor workers, and speakeasies. Luciano's friendship with Meyer Lansky, already formed in childhood, became central. Where many old-school Sicilian bosses distrusted non-Italians, Luciano saw allies and accountants. He saw people who could raise capital, launder profits, and design sophisticated rackets. He began as a lieutenant in the chaotic underworld of early Prohibition, a facilitator who arranged shipments, bribed dock workers, and organized armed crews to protect cargo. Those crews could hijack rival shipments as well. Violence remained part of the business model, but Luciano's genius was to fuse brutality with organization. He standardized protection fees, developed predictable routes, and built a rudimentary ledger of who owed what. The result? Reliable revenue streams that didn't depend on random street hustles. The 1920s gangster era is often pictured as continuous shootouts. In reality, much of Luciano's work involved deals. Violence was a tool, but Luciano preferred agreements. He brokered arrangements with local politicians and police through systematic bribery. He put money into the right campaign coffers, greased the palms of precinct captains, and ensured that safe houses and warehouses were left alone. His ability to negotiate was as valuable as his willingness to order a hit. Luciano cut pacts with Jewish and Irish mobsters, sharing territories and profits on mutually beneficial terms. These alliances reduced the cost of doing illegal business. Fewer wars meant more predictable cash. Luciano didn't romanticize violence. He monetized stability. By the mid-1920s, Luciano's reputation as a reliable earner and a competent manager earned him the attention of bigger men. He was smart, energetic, and ruthlessly practical. He demonstrated a capacity to run complex operations and to keep men loyal. He also had something many bosses lacked: an instinct for organization that mirrored legitimate business management. His operations expanded into extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and narcotics. But bootlegging remained central. Luciano supervised operations that supplied speakeasies across Manhattan and Brooklyn. He coordinated with wholesalers, ensured shipments arrived intact, and managed distribution networks that reached into upper-class neighborhoods and elite clubs. The money flowed fast, and it flowed clean, at least until you realized how much of it vanished into payoffs, protection, and silent knives. The real barrier to Luciano's expansion was not the law, but tradition. The Mustache Petes, veteran Sicilian bosses, were conservative and parochial. They wanted to preserve old codes, ethnic purity, and deference to custom. Luciano saw those codes as a handicap. He wanted operational flexibility. He wanted to use non-Italians as partners and to make the organization look less like a clan and more like a corporation. This ambition inevitably produced conflict. Luciano maneuvered deftly. He cultivated patrons among older bosses by offering them a cut of the profits and by demonstrating how modern organization would multiply their returns. When persuasion failed, Luciano did not hesitate to use force or political pressure. He was pragmatic. If an old-line capo refused to adapt, Luciano had men who could change their minds permanently. The late 1920s and early 1930s saw the eruption of the Castellammarese War, a bloody struggle among New York's factions. Different groups vied for control of bootlegging routes and rackets. The violence threatened to dismantle the profitable order that Luciano and others were trying to build. Here, Luciano's model proved resilient. Instead of doubling down on ethnic loyalty and vendetta, he sought to reorganize power through negotiation backed by credible force. He covertly allied with figures like Lucky A. Name, whose roots in luck and survival began to take on strategic meaning, and he exploited enemies' weaknesses. Luciano's strategy was to eliminate the most intransigent leaders and to consolidate the rest under a rational structure. When the blood stopped, Luciano emerged not as a battlefield king, but as a broker of a new system. The old warlords had been weakened or eliminated. Their territories were ripe for a corporate-style takeover. Luciano and his cohort moved in quickly, converting chaotic revenue into institutionalized profit centers. By the early 1930s, Luciano was no longer a local lieutenant. He was an architect of national reach. The success of his bootlegging networks gave him the capital to diversify. Investments into gambling, prostitution, unions, and later offshore operations like Havana's casinos. His partnerships with Jewish gangsters, particularly Lansky, allowed for financial innovation and international connections that older bosses rarely pursued. But his greatest move was structural: the idea of a commission, a governing council where major crime families would meet to allocate territory and settle disputes without open warfare. It was the ultimate pro-business solution. Create governance to reduce transaction costs, i.e., murders, wars, seizures, and maximize long-term, jointly held profits. That was Luciano's genius: turn anarchy into regulated enterprise. The era of Prohibition was the crucible in which Lucky Luciano's modern mafia was forged. He transformed thuggery into trade, replaced vendetta with arbitration, and expanded petty hustles into national enterprises. His talent was not merely in violence, but in systems thinking, logistics, alliance building, and the institutionalization of crime. By streamlining bootlegging, negotiating alliances, and professionalizing corruption, Luciano set a template that outlasted him. The old chaotic wars gave way to a new order where bosses traded bloodshed for boardroom-like meetings. The streets of New York had changed, and lucky Luciano stood at the center of that change. When the guns finally fell silent after the bloody Castellammarese War, New York's criminal landscape was a ruin and an opportunity at once. Old shields lay broken. Petty vendettas had thinned ranks, and the flow of illicit income, bootlegging, gambling, protection rackets, was interrupted by continual bloodshed. Into that vacuum stepped lucky Luciano, not as a conqueror who reveled in the kill, but as a manager who preferred contracts over carnage. The brilliance of Luciano was not merely that he could survive violence, it was that he could replace it with governance. He had watched how warfare eroded profit and how unstable empires attracted law enforcement attention. If crime was going to be sustainable, it needed rules, a forum for negotiation, and a bureaucratic backbone. This was the idea that led to the most consequential innovation in American organized crime, the Commission. The Commission was, in essence, a board of directors for the Mafia. Luciano proposed that the major families, the principal Italian-American organizations operating across New York and beyond, meet periodically to resolve disputes, allocate territories, and approve major actions like murders of high-ranking members. No longer would every slight be answered with a privately motivated execution that risked triggering wider war. Instead, disagreements would be mediated. Major decisions would have collective oversight. For the older Sicilian bosses who measured power by vendetta and lineage, this concept felt sacrilegious. But for businessmen, Luciano and his circle, the Commission made sense. It lowered transaction costs. Fewer wars meant predictable revenue. Predictable revenue meant easier investment, deeper penetration into legitimate businesses, and more sophisticated laundering. It was the criminal equivalent of corporate governance. Governance designed to stabilize and scale illicit enterprise. Luciano didn't build the Commission alone. He leaned heavily on alliances with non-Italian partners, most notably Meyer Lansky, and on pragmatic leaders willing to sacrifice ego for profit. Families that accepted the new order suddenly saw value in cooperation. Names like Joe Adonis, Tommy Lucchese, and other influential bosses became part of the de facto council that kept New York's underworld functioning. Under this system, disputes that would once have led to months of violence were negotiated behind closed doors. Territories were parceled out with paperwork-like precision. Who ran the docks? Who ran the garment district loan sharking? Who controlled the unions that steered contracts to mob-connected companies? The Commission also established a protocol for disciplining unpredictable actors, limiting rogue violence that could invite federal scrutiny. One of Luciano's most lasting changes was how he institutionalized corruption. The Mafia under his leadership did not simply bribe a cop or threaten a local official. It built relationships, systematic, regular, and layered with politicians, union bosses, and business owners. Luciano's crews learned to invest in influence. Campaign contributions funneled through intermediaries, union endorsements courted with favors, and city contracts steered toward companies that paid a tax to the mob. This institutional approach gave the Mafia something most criminal organizations lack: predictability. Construction projects flowed. Union pension funds became a vehicle for loans and kickbacks. The organized crime world began to mimic corporate structures so closely that its illegal cash streams could be funneled into legitimate enterprises. which in turn increased the veneer of respectability and the ability to hide profits. As the 1930s wore on, Luciano's vision extended beyond New York. He and his associates cultivated operations that reached into Florida, Cuba, and even parts of Europe. Havana, with its casinos and hotels, became a lucrative destination for American mob capital, and Luciano's structures allowed investment and management at scale. These overseas ventures required partnerships and a level of logistical expertise that few crime figures before him had attempted. The international focus also opened channels for money laundering and offshore movement of assets. Luciano and his circle used complex networks of shell companies, front men, and foreign accounts to reposition wealth tactics that would make the mob less vulnerable to single-point seizures and law enforcement audits. For all the stability that the commission brought, it didn't make the Mafia invisible. What Luciano created was a more efficient system of crime, but the scale of operations invited greater attention. Law enforcement agencies began to take notice of the way crime had professionalized. Federal agents were a growing, if still embryonic, threat. Corruption made the mob powerful, but also created more points of exposure. Disgruntled partners, bribed officials who could flip, and complex financial arrangements that, if traced, could reveal systemic corruption. Moreover, the commission could suppress open war, but it could not erase ambition. The very leaders who agreed to abide by rules could, in time, chafe at them. New generations of mobsters, less respectful of the old codes and more tempted by quick gains, posed another kind of danger. The centralized model depended on a mix of respect and fear. When either fractured, the system stood on shaky ground. Luciano's leadership style marked a generational change. He was not the archetypal warrior boss, he was a strategist and administrator. He cultivated accountants, lawyers, and diplomats among his allies. Where earlier bosses valued bloodlines and brute force, Luciano valued reliability, flexibility, and the capacity to negotiate complex deals. His recruitment favored competence over lineage. Men who could manage unions, run numbers operations flawlessly, or broker relationships with politicians were prized. This managerial approach attracted talent and money, and it professionalized crime in a way that would persist long after Luciano himself exited center stage. The Mafia became, in many ways, a shadow corporation, complete with hierarchies, delegated authority, and governance mechanisms. Part 4 of Lucky Luciano's story shows a man who recognized that power is most durable when it is organized. By building the commission and introducing a corporate logic to crime, Luciano reduced violence, increased profitability, and created structures that allowed organized crime to flourish under a new logic of efficiency. Yet that very efficiency, its scale, sophistication, and integration into legitimate sectors, also planted the seeds of future vulnerability. Luciano's revolution was not merely tactical, it was structural. He changed how crime was done, not just who was doing it. That change would ripple through decades of American history, shaping the underworld and ensuring that Luciano's name would be spoken in the same breath as the idea of modern organized crime. When the world went to war in 1939, the United States' entry in 1941 transformed every corner of American life, including its underworld. For Lucky Luciano, the global conflict created paradoxical possibilities. The same empire that made him a target of law enforcement could also make him useful to the nation he nominally opposed. What followed was one of the strangest bargains in American history. a temporary truce between the federal government and organized crime, brokered under the pressure of war. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's rising power had attracted intense attention. Law enforcement in New York, emboldened by political pressure and determined prosecutors, had been steadily closing in on the bootlegging-era godfathers and their modern successors. In 1936, after a lengthy investigation into prostitution rings that flourished in numerous brothels and nightclubs, Luciano was indicted and tried. The prosecution argued that he directed and profited from an extensive forced prostitution network charges that pierced his carefully constructed veil of plausible deniability. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. For a man who had reorganized the underworld into a business-like enterprise, the conviction represented both a personal humiliation and a structural shock. One of the architects of the new criminal order had been physically removed from his post. Yet even behind bars, Lucky was no ordinary inmate. He continued to command respect, and his network remained operational. Imprisonment changed his role, but it did not erase his influence. By 1942, the stakes had shifted dramatically. With the United States fully engaged in World War II, the vulnerability of the home front became a public obsession. One glaring fear involved the New York waterfront. Docks, cargo ships, and naval facilities were critical to the war effort, and they were vulnerable to sabotage, strikes, and infiltration. Reports of Axis agents probing American ports added a layer of panic to an already tense environment. The Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, and other federal agencies scrambled to secure the docks. They faced a practical problem. The waterfront was controlled by labor unions and criminal crews that only the mob could influence. Police and honest officials lacked the muscle or local sway to ensure cooperation. So the government considered an ugly but pragmatic option: use organized crime's influence to keep the docks running and to root out potential sabotage. The result was Operation Underworld, a covert arrangement in which U.S. naval and intelligence officials quietly contacted underworld figures to secure waterfront cooperation. Lucky Luciano, imprisoned but still seen as a central node in the criminal network, became an unexpected point of contact. Through intermediaries and mutual acquaintances, federal agents proposed a deal. In exchange for Luciano's cooperation contacts in the docks, ability to influence union leaders, and intelligence on suspected Axis activity, the government would consider leniency. Luciano and his associates were pragmatic. For Lucky, the deal offered something more valuable than immediate freedom. It offered leverage. By cooperating with authorities during wartime, he could position himself as a useful asset rather than merely a criminal. The arrangement wasn't publicized. It was a wartime expedient, an unseemly marriage of convenience between the state and the underworld. Operation Underworld achieved mixed results. The docks were kept functioning. Strike threats were softened. There are credible accounts that mob contacts helped identify and neutralize certain sabotage risks. For the Navy and ONI, the results justified the means. For the public, should they have known, the notion of government collusion with gangsters would have been a shock. But the arrangement also generated moral and political fallout. Critics argued that bargaining with criminals undermined the rule of law. Others feared the precedent it set. If the state could cut deals with criminals during a crisis, what would stop similar bargains later for less noble purposes? Meanwhile, inside the underworld, Luciano's cooperation became ammunition for rivals and for prosecutors who would later point to the unsavory bargains as evidence of a compromised figure. In 1946, with the war long over, the strange wartime accommodation reached a public denouement. New York's governor commuted Luciano's sentence, and Luciano was deported to Italy rather than returned to the United States as a free man. The official reasoning cited his cooperation during the war. Critics decried the commutation as political favoritism influenced by hidden deals and pressure. The move allowed the state to remove a potent criminal actor while avoiding the spectacle and political risk of keeping him behind bars for life. The commutation and deportation did not erase controversy. Many in law enforcement and the public believed that luck, influence, and expedience had triumphed where justice should have reigned. For Luciano's enemies, the move was another example of his uncanny ability to turn fate to his advantage. For Luciano himself, exile was bittersweet. He was free of prison, but he was also expelled from the land where he built his empire. Luciano's wartime bargaining exposed the fragile boundaries between legality and necessity, between crime and statecraft. He had built an empire on the ability to organize, to coordinate, and to exert influence. Those skills made him useful in wartime, and they also made him a liability to the public order. He paid a price: years in prison, the loss of direct control, and eventual exile. But he also secured survival and a continued role as a player, albeit from overseas. His fate underscored a central paradox in the life of a man like Luciano. Institutional strength can both empower and endanger. The very networks and relationships that created a business like Mafia also created vulnerabilities, touchpoints that governments could exploit or punish. Luciano's pragmatic willingness to bargain with authorities revealed a calculating mind that valued survival and influence over purity of principle. Part 5 of Lucky Luciano's story is the story of uneasy bargains made under duress. It is the tale of a man whose criminal genius made him an asset to his country in a moment of existential crisis, and whose criminal record made him a target the moment the crisis ended. Operation Underworld still provokes debate. Was it a necessary wartime compromise, or a stain on the integrity of American institutions? For Luciano, the episode was transformative. He left U.S. soil a convicted man, but not a broken one. Exile would change how he exercised influence, but it did not erase the institutional changes he had engineered. The commission, the methods, and the alliances lived on. And as the world moved into the post-war era, Lucky Luciano remained a name that signaled both criminal mastery and the ambiguous moral compromises of wartime governance. When New York's governor commuted Lucky Luciano's sentence in 1946 and the federal government arranged his deportation to Italy, many expected that the architect of the modern Mafia would disappear. Banished from American soil, stripped of his direct control, his power supposed to wither like a candle snuffed out. Instead, exile forced Luciano to reinvent his methods of influence. He lost the daily command post, but he didn't lose the network. From abroad, he sought to protect his investments, manage alliances, and stage a comeback quietly, patiently, and with the same strategic mind that once restructured the American underworld. Luciano's return to Italy was bitter and strange. He arrived in a country that was simultaneously familiar and foreign. Familiar in language and blood, foreign in modern politics and wartime ruin. Italy in the late 1940s was rebuilding. Sicily's old criminal patterns remained, but the post-war realities had shifted. Luciano found himself in a landscape where old family ties mattered again. but where new opportunities, smuggling, narcotics, international ports were emerging. Exile curtailed his freedom of movement and his capacity to run daily rackets, yet it created incentives to expand in other directions. From Naples and Rome, he cultivated long-distance contacts, lawyers, couriers, trusted lieutenants in New York, and Sicilian intermediaries who still controlled islands of influence. He played the role of the strategist in absentia, issuing orders indirectly, settling disputes through emissaries, and protecting the institutions he had built by ensuring continuity among loyal captains. Part of Luciano's post-deportation strategy involved cultivating international nodes, places where underworld money could be both made and hidden. Havana, pre-revolutionary Cuba, with its casinos, hotels, and permissive climate for U.S. capital, proved attractive. While Luciano's direct involvement varied by account, historians agree that the structures he had helped create partnerships between Italian and Jewish mob figures, the use of front companies, and offshore mechanisms made international operations possible even without his physical presence. From exile, Luciano and his close associates coordinated investments, moved funds, and maintained lines of credit to American operations. The transatlantic Mafia was no longer a fantasy. It was a functioning web in which Luciano remained an influential node. His ability to link financiers, fixers, and operators in multiple countries kept him relevant and kept the commission-style order alive, even as he watched from afar. Another wrinkle in Luciano's exile was his continued association, real or rumored, with state actors. Operation Underworld had established that the U.S. government could and would talk to criminals during wartime exigency. In the chaotic years after the war, whispers continued. Intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic valued Luciano's knowledge of ports, smugglers, and clandestine networks. Whether these contacts were formal or informal, the result was a complicated status. Luciano was simultaneously a wanted criminal in the eyes of many and a useful informant or contact in the eyes of some officials. This ambiguity provided a degree of protection and leverage. If Western intelligence agencies occasionally needed access to the channels Luciano knew, then keeping him under a degree of supervision, but not total isolation, served mutual interests. For Luciano, it meant that exile did not necessarily mean erasure. It meant adaptation. For all his maneuvering, Luciano yearned to return to the United States. The country where he had accumulated wealth and influence remained the center of his ambition. He petitioned, pressed allies, and sought legal avenues to secure re-entry. But American authorities were wary. The memory of Prohibition-era violence and organized prostitution had not faded. Many politicians and lawmen resisted any notion of reinstating the man who had reorganized crime into a national system. Luciano's legal and political battles highlighted a paradox. Although his wartime cooperation had produced some degree of leniency, public opinion and institutional caution prevented a true homecoming. Deportation became exile in perpetuity for many. He could visit or transact indirectly, but the old comforts of direct control were gone. Over time, Luciano faced increased scrutiny abroad as well. Local authorities tracked his movements, and rival families used his absence as an opening to expand. Exile transformed Luciano's leadership style even further. He perfected a governance by proxy model, relying on trusted capos, extended family members, and transnational partners to enforce decisions. Letters, coded messages, and clandestine meetings became the instruments of rule. Luciano's network became more resilient in some ways, less reliant on a single figure physically present, but more vulnerable in others. Intermediaries could be compromised, loyalties could shift, and distance hampered instant crisis management. Crucially, Luciano's role evolved from hands-on boss to elder statesman. He advised, arbitrated, and preserved norms. He meditated disputes that might otherwise have ended in violence, and his symbolic authority rooted in the system he built retained weight. But the absence of direct enforcement meant his decrees sometimes relied on reputation rather than immediate force, and reputation can be eroded by time. While Luciano sought to hold the line, a new generation of mobsters came of age, men who had spent their primes under his order, but who now had their own agendas. Some embraced his rules, others quietly adapted them to local contexts. Rival bosses in New York and Sicily probed for weaknesses. The Commission's authority remained, but the balance of power shifted subtly. Luciano, once the unchallenged architect, now navigated a more plural, contested landscape. Exile also meant increased vulnerability to law enforcement tactics that targeted international finance, narcotics trafficking, and cross-border smuggling. Agencies in different countries began to cooperate more, and Luciano's international ties became, at times, liabilities rather than assets. Part 6 of Lucky Luciano's saga is the story of adaptation under constraint. Stripped of territory and direct power, Luciano displayed a different kind of competence. The ability to manage influence across borders, to leverage old ties in new ways, and to remain a force in the underworld without setting foot in the country that had once been his stage. Yet exile also revealed the limits of institutionalized criminal power. Distance dilutes authority, proxies falter, and loyalties shift. Luciano's exile was not a simple fall, it was a transformation. He did not vanish, he changed. The underworld he created could survive without him physically present, but it also began to mutate beyond his full control. In the years ahead, the once modern Mafia would face new pressures: organized law enforcement, shifting geopolitics, and societal change that would test the resilience of Luciano's legacy. Lucky Luciano's final act came not in a courtroom or on a gritty New York street, but quietly in the coastal city of Naples, far from the docks and social clubs that had made his name. On January 26, 1962, Charles Lucky Luciano died of natural causes, a heart attack compounded by a long decline in health. The death was unglamorous and contained no last-minute reversals of fortune. For a man who had reshaped organized crime on a transatlantic scale, the end was unexpectedly small. No gunfire, no dramatic final betrayal, no public execution, just the slow erasure of a life that had once cast a very long shadow. Yet the simplicity of Luciano's death belied the complexity of the legacy he left behind. To understand that legacy is to reckon with paradox. He built order out of chaos, replaced blood feuds with boardroom-style governance, and professionalized crime in ways that made it both more profitable and more durable, and at the same time more visible and, therefore, more vulnerable. When historians and law enforcement look back at Lucky Luciano, they rarely describe him as merely a gangster. They call him an architect. He did not invent the criminal enterprise, but he refashioned it. He transformed disparate street gangs into a networked system of families, codified a system of rules that regulated violence, and introduced the kind of administrative thinking that allowed criminal operations to scale nationally and internationally. The Commission, the negotiated map of territory and influence he championed, became the operating manual for decades of organized crime. That institutional legacy is both his remarkable achievement and the central reason his name endures. The modern mafia's longevity, its infiltration of unions, construction, gambling, and legitimate businesses, can be traced to Luciano's insistence that crime be run like a business, with accounts, divisions of labor, and governance mechanisms to reduce the cost of conflict. Where earlier bosses relied primarily on personal charisma and localized force, Luciano built systems that could outlast a single life. Luciano's life forces a difficult question. Can someone who provided practical benefits in wartime, helping to secure docks, for example, be disentangled from the harm their structures later caused? Operation Underworld, the wartime arrangement that saw U.S. naval and intelligence officials temporarily cooperate with mob figures, reveals the moral ambiguity of Luciano's story. In one framing, he was a patriot who lent illicit influence to a national emergency. In another, he was a criminal who leveraged exigency to bargain for leniency and continued influence. This ambiguity extends into law and politics. Luciano's commutation and eventual deportation, outcomes shaped by clandestine bargains as much as by law, highlighted a tension between pragmatic governance and the principle that criminals should face consistent justice. For many, his release and exile illustrated how power can distort legal outcomes, while for others it was an expedient wartime compromise. The debate remains: did the government do what it had to do, or did it make an unacceptable compromise with organized crime? Luciano's influence spills into American culture as well. The Mafia, as it appears in novels, films, and television, the mix of brutal efficiency, oddly formal codes of loyalty, and the tragic dignity of dying bosses, is filtered through the changes Luciano introduced. Stories about organized crime often borrow his themes: a shadowy council, business-like allocations of territory, and the tragic arc of men who gain power through pragmatic ruthlessness, only to be undone by the same human frailties they tried to manage. Hollywood and popular media turned elements of his life into archetypes. The image of the Don as both a brutal enforcer and a strategist, the idea that crime can mimic corporate governance, and the recurring motif of betrayal and exile, all of these bear Luciano's imprint. His life became a template, a cautionary tale, and a dramatic model rolled into one. Paradoxically, Luciano's modernization of crime hastened the development of modern law enforcement techniques. The Mafia's growing scale created paper trails, money flows, and patterns that could be traced. Federal agencies developed wiretaps, financial investigations, and interagency cooperation precisely because organized crime had become sophisticated enough to require sophisticated responses. In this sense, Luciano's success forced governments to evolve, a legacy that led decades later to the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, and other tools that allowed prosecutors to dismantle complex criminal networks. So the system he helped build contained its own corrective. Increased visibility demanded more specialized, coordinated policing. The more the Mafia behaved like a corporation, the more legal instruments and investigative methods could be brought to bear against it. Luciano's story is also a lesson about the limits of centralized design. He organized power to reduce violence and stabilize profit. But he could not forever control the ambitions and greed of those who benefited from his structures. New generations, changing political climates, and the invasion of other criminal economies, like large-scale narcotics trafficking, fractured the order he established. The Mafia's shift into drug trade in later decades, often at odds with the Commission's earlier rules, and the betrayal of norms by individuals chasing short-term gain, showed that institutions formed by expediency remain vulnerable to human unpredictability. Luciano's exile underlined this truth. Removed from daily decision-making, his authority slowly softened. The system continued, but it also mutated. The stability he engineered created new incentives for adaptation, and not all adaptations preserved the institutional equilibrium he had intended. Lucky Luciano's death was unceremonious, but his legacy was anything but. He reimagined criminality for the 20th century, professionalizing it, internationalizing it, and embedding it into sectors of legitimate commerce. He proved that pragmatism could produce order where chaos had reigned, but he also revealed that such order comes at a cost to law, to ordinary citizens exploited by rackets, and to the moral fabric of institutions that sometimes find themselves compromising for expedience. To study Luciano is not to glamorize him. It is to understand how structures of power form, how institutions, legal or illegal, institutionalize behavior, and how a single visionary, for better or worse, can reshape an entire field. He remains, historically, a figure who forces uncomfortable questions about the relationship between governance and greed, between necessity and principle, and between the durable logic of systems and the fragile ethics of human choices. In the end, Lucky Luciano didn't die at the business desk he had designed. He died a man removed from the field he had transformed. Yet the commission he helped create, the bureaucratic innovations he instituted, and the complex debates about law, policy, and morality he provoked, ensure that his name will linger in discussions of power and organized crime for generations to come.